Welcome to Garden and Nature Southwest. I'm Vani Shukla. Yesterday, I was walking around in my garden taking some notes on the plants that were doing well, or they were blooming, or some were struggling, or what kind of wildlife was around. I was also reflecting on how the summer garden has evolved over time, how it looks different from a few years back, and every year it looks different. I was also reflecting on my own perception about the garden. When I initially used to garden here and did not know much about gardening in the hot summer temperatures here, the dry, hot winds that are around in many regions of the Southwest, it was difficult to garden, and very often it was disappointing to see the plants struggle in the hot summer weather. So my perception has changed as well, but so has the garden. I thought I'll share with you some observations on the plants that are growing in the garden right now, also the wildlife that is around, and also some of my thoughts about what has evolved and how it has evolved and how it has changed, including my perceptions and my thought process about the garden, which I think makes a big difference in how we garden, how we approach gardening. So the first plant that I would mention that is pretty much all around my garden at this time is Anisacanthus. And any plants or wildlife that I mention in today's episode, I will list that in the show notes as well as on the website. And just mentioning as a reminder, it's important to check the plant with the scientific name to correctly identify it. So anyway, the first plant I would mention is Anisacanthus, and it is something that is all around my garden. It very easily reseeds itself. When I first started it was just 2 plants about 5 years ago. And from that, now it's everywhere. Now, just to give you an idea, it is actually a bush about 2 to 3 feet tall. The tallest is probably 3.5 or maybe 4 feet in my garden. But depending on how old the plant is, it can be really lush green, versus if it's older, then it can have the woody stems and the branches, so it can have a very different look. But it is wonderful for hummingbirds and bees and other pollinators because of the tubular red flowers, and which are very nectar rich. I've also seen verdins eating the flowers itself. I think they eat the base of the flowers and probably get to the nectar. But definitely a reliable source, absolutely reliable source for the hummingbirds. And that's why I let them grow in many places in the garden. And it is also growing in one area that I have no irrigation in. I'm mentioning this area because here it's grown quite big, and this is the area I have been experimenting with without any irrigation. So there are several plants here that do not have any irrigation. And the rain that we get is very less. It's about 7 to 9 inches a year. It's a very desert, dry climate here in the Chihuahuan Desert region in the West Texas area that I'm in. So it's entirely dependent on just rainwater, not supplying it with any rain tanks or any other supplemental rainwater, just the natural rain that falls. So very tough plant, tolerates heat really well. And because it is such a reliable source for the hummingbirds and other nectar-loving insects and pollinators, I just love this plant. It also looks good. Just the bright red flowers which appear and which stay just that bright, even in the hot summer temperatures, even when it's 100-degree temperatures. It starts to flower maybe at the end of May here, and continues throughout the summertime and through fall. Now, in the garden, depending on different locations, it has different looks and different age of the plant. The newer ones are looking much greener and lush, whereas the older plants, the ones that have been there for 3 years, 2 years or older, they have more woody appearance. They have some branches that may not have any leaves at all. There might be some branches that are dead. Now, previously I used to get those pruned off. I would be really after them and pruning and taking care of all those things so that the plant appears in the best shape and looks well. I no longer do that. And it was not a sudden change. It was more of a gradual change, gradual evolution. I started to realize that it really didn't matter in the overall look. I sort of like it this way. It's different looks in different areas. It's a little bit of a wilder look. But other major reason for allowing that to happen is that previously, years back, my attention used to be just on the plants. And now, when I'm looking at a plant, my attention also goes to what is on that plant. Very often there are these big bumblebees or butterflies or other tiny small native bees that are there, and my attention goes there as well. And how these creatures, these insects and birds are using that plant. Sometimes the Anisacanthus bushes can get really big, so many of these branches are dried up, but the rest of the plant is full of flowers. So when the hummingbird is visiting, it's going from flower to flowers, and in one bush there can be like hundreds of flowers. So the hummingbird is going from flower to flower, and then what it does, it just goes and sits on that dry, dead branch and sits there for a long time. And what I'm seeing is that hummingbird resting on that dried up branch that I would have probably in the past taken off. So a lot of this acceptance of dried up parts of the plant or plant not looking in the perfect green shape and the perfect color, a lot of this acceptance also comes from the fact that the attention is no longer solely on the plant. It is also on what is around it. Same way, the desert willow tree is usually quite tolerant of the hot weather, but the blooms, the flowers, are no longer as bright as they used to be. But they don't bother me as much. What the attention goes to is, again, the hundreds of bees and the pollinators and the hummingbirds that are going on to the plant. So it does not disappoint me anymore. Whereas in the past, I would have been disappointed by the hot summer temperatures damaging the flowers, taking the color off, and I would be just waiting for that cooler temperature, that fall season to arrive when the plants can perk up again. Now, that is the perception change, but also a big fact is that the garden changes as well. When you first start your garden, when there are fewer plants, the summer heat, it heats up the garden a lot more compared to when your garden is more mature. When the garden is more mature, when you step out, yes, it feels hot, but your attention goes to so many other different things too, and you do find shade, you do find areas which are not that hot. The elderberry tree at this time is grown quite a bit, and it has a lot of shade, and underneath that we have a seating area now. So I sometimes just go out for a few minutes and sit outside, and attention is no longer on how hot the temperature is. Rather, it goes on to something interesting that is happening. Just like yesterday, I was sitting there for just a few minutes, and in those few minutes I saw this bush tit further towards the boundary wall where I have bird feeder that is filled with nesting material, just pure cotton. And so it was there and was pulling out the cotton and then flew away with that. It was just really going at it and pulling out all the threads. So it was really fun to watch. So in those few moments, as I was watching this little bird, the bush tit, I wasn't thinking about how hot the temperature is. It was just fun to watch that. So a lot more happens. A lot more activity happens in a mature garden that makes it more enjoyable. So I think that is one big part. But also the bare ground, it reflects a lot of heat. So your garden is hotter when it first starts, whether you're starting on a bare soil or it might have some mulching in form of gravel that is present in a lot of areas in our southwest region. If you're moving into a house that already has some landscaping, oftentimes it's gravel, and that gets really hot in the summertime. But as you increase the planting, especially with the native plants, and I say especially the native plants because they are well adapted here, they will attract more wildlife, they will create a healthier ecosystem in the garden. So I have seen that difference, definitely, no question about it. A native plant garden is more lively, and even in the hot summer temperatures, it has a more lively feel to it compared to when you have non-native plants. Now, if you have non-native plants but that are well adapted to the region, as we are getting more and more in many of the nurseries these days, that there are plants that are non-native to the southwest area, non-native to US. These are plants from other regions of the world that have similar climate to ours. So these plants can adapt very well to our climates. But one big difference is that they may not attract that much wildlife. They may not contribute that much to the healthier ecosystem compared to a native plant that has evolved here, that has been always the part of ecosystem. So it will attract more insects, and more insects will bring more wildlife. So this ecosystem is what might be lacking in the beginning when the garden is just being started. So as my garden has grown over these last 5-6 years, all that plant material that develops, that dries out, that falls down, it becomes mulch. It covers the ground. Also, the ground covers that I have grown, the plants that cover the ground. So, for example, one of the plants that I have is Dalea greggii. It is a very drought tolerant, very heat tolerant plant. It has purple flowers and it spreads pretty well. It throws out long branches, and wherever these branches touch the ground, they just continue to sprout roots there. So that's how it grows. And there are so many butterflies and bees, different wasps. It's just covered with insects, covered with life. So whenever I'm going, there's just little tiny blue butterflies fluttering around. It's a great plant to have. So this is an example of ground covers. I have other ground covers like hairy five eyes. This just naturally volunteered in my garden, and initially I thought it was a weed, but later I found out that it was a native plant and I let it grow. It's a wonderful, wonderful ground cover. Tons of pollinators, especially in the springtime. Now the flowering has slowed down, but the area is green and densely covered. Non-irrigated, completely no irrigation in that area. So all this is happening as the garden is growing. These plants were very small, or plants were not there in the beginning, and now all these plants are there which are covering the ground. There is a lot of leaf litter and natural mulch, and I often see when I'm walking around, I often see the whiptail lizards that are rustling underneath these ground covers or the mulch. And it's fun to see them. Sometimes they stop and they're just trying to look at you. It's fun watching the wildlife in the garden. Also, as many of the plants reseed themselves, you will find in some areas they are doing really well, and even in really hot season, these plants in these corners are looking like bright green foliage with beautiful flowers. And one of the plants that I could mention like that is Blackfoot daisy. It is also everywhere in my garden, front yard, side yard, backyard. And in some areas, the flowers are wilted. Plant seems to be struggling. I know it will come back, so I don't worry about it or anything. But that is the observation. It is struggling in some areas. The south side of my garden, or in areas where it's just hot sun throughout the day. And in some other corners of the yard where it's dappled shade, or it might be just the morning sun exposure. It's in the eastern part of the house. In those areas, it looks like they're enjoying a spring weather almost. They're full of flowers. The leaves are looking green and very fresh. So it does make a big difference in where the plants are located. And as the garden matures, you will find that plants have themselves chosen to grow in certain areas that they find favorable. So this is a part of the evolution and the growth of the garden. And we as gardeners, then when we are observing that, it also helps us realize that when we try to control and grow everything in its place where we want to and how we want to, it may not always work, and it ends up being more stressful. Some other plants that are currently blooming and attracting hummingbirds and other pollinators are yellow bells. These are also very tough plants. The foliage also appears very green, like bright green. And of course, the flowers are in big bunches. So these are really good as well. And they can, if you let them in some areas, they can grow really tall. So they can also help to create some shade. When we're talking about shade in the garden, it's not just the big trees that you're looking for when you're looking for shade in the garden. Also, the small areas of shade that are caused by these bushes and other smaller or medium-sized plants. So, for example, Anisacanthus that I had mentioned earlier, it is in so many areas of my garden, and it is creating these little pockets of shade around it. That can help these little other plants grow or appear more lush and have flowers that are lasting longer in these pockets, in these shaded pockets. So these bushes not only help to provide shelter and flowers and all those, but also the shade that they provide in these little areas are helpful. So coming to the yellow bells, when they grow bigger, and if this is an area that you can let them grow big, not only lots of flowers, but also it provides that shade and just the coolness in the garden that a greenery provides. Now, other plants that are really doing well and brightening up the summers are desert marigolds, Gaillardias. They have really bright flowers. Also, how can I forget the chocolate daisies as well? They are always blooming. So these plants, for example, the desert marigolds, they are always with bright yellow flowers, even in hot summer weather. Same with Gaillardia. Now, in the areas where there's a partial shade because of a bush near it, there are more flowers in the Gaillardia, which is also called Blanketflowers. There are more flowers, the flowers last longer, but even in the areas that are fully exposed, there are some flowers. It's not entirely without flowers. But there are some places that it does struggle, depending on the irrigation and the duration of the sun that it faces during the day. But again, it does really well. Chocolate daisies, during the hot afternoon time, the flowers don't appear bright, but they're there. But you know what? I often see the finches. Previously, it used to be just the lesser goldfinches, but now I see also the house finches have discovered that they're delicious. So I often see the finches are after these seed heads, or sometimes even the flowers, and they're just ripping them apart and picking, and who knows what they're eating. But it's just fun to watch them. And I have so many plants around, just kind of freely reseeding, and I leave them around. I don't mind. Actually, I enjoy that these birds are eating them, and it doesn't bother me that the plant is damaged or anything. Previously it might have, long back when I did not have these wild birds in my garden, did not know anything about native plants. At that time, if any creature, any insect or bird would eat the plant or be on the plant, I would be really concerned that the plant is getting damaged. Now I find that the birds, all this wildlife, is part of garden. Garden is not just plants, it's the whole thing. That's what makes it enjoyable. So it's fun watching these house finches and the lesser goldfinches go after the daisies, the chocolate daisies. So even though they're not so bright, they're still very enjoyable in the garden at this time. So they continue to bloom, and in the morning they still have that fragrance. And again, if I were to compare it to the springtime, definitely it is different that in the springtime it is a lot more fragrance, and the flowers continue to appear bright most of the day, but that's a bit different in the summertime. But again, definitely not disappointing. Far from it. It's still so enjoyable. Another plant that I would mention is rock penstemon. Usually the penstemons are blooming in the springtime, but this is one of those that continues to bloom throughout the summertime as well. And it takes any kind of soil. I have it in different areas. It doesn't take too much water well, though. It doesn't bloom that much. At least in my garden, it's not blooming that much in the areas that have a little bit more irrigation. It does better. It flowers better in the areas that are more rocky and less irrigation. But it performs very well. Reliable source for hummingbirds as well. So wonderful plant. Another one is Stachys, coccinea. Common name is betoni, Texas betoni. And that also freely reseeds. It's everywhere in my garden. Hummingbirds love it. It has red flowers. It's a plant about maybe 18 inches tall, and it can become bushy. But again, when it reseeds in different areas, you will find these plants in different shapes and sizes depending on the area it is in. And that also creates a very interesting look in the garden. All these plants can be found in different stages, different age. Some are woody, some are just fresh growth. That variety, that difference makes the garden a lot more interesting. I have a woolly butterfly bush that is not to be confused with the common, very popular butterfly bush that is out there. This is a woolly butterfly bush. This is a native plant, and it also has some blooms. Butterflies are visiting. That is another thing that I noticed during summertime is that the butterflies, because of the temperatures being hot, they start to arrive earlier in the morning. In the springtime and the fall, when the mornings are cooler, they take a little bit longer. Only when the day warms up that they show up in your garden. But in summertime, they show up early in the morning as well. As soon as the sun is up, they're around. And because the garden has more of these shaded pockets, even in really hot days, these butterflies are here. So a lot more butterflies throughout the day that you see in the summertime, especially when the garden is mature, when you have all these places to hide, when you have a lot of leaf litter and the bushes and plants of different stages. These butterflies have places to hide and places to lay eggs, and they find their host plants because you have all this diversity there in the garden. So it is lively even in the summertime. Very different from spring and fall. Each season has its different feel, different look. I have stopped comparing different seasons, which I used to. I used to feel spring is always the best time and fall is the second best. I no longer see it that way. So that has also evolved. That is an evolution one goes through. It is not something that can be forced upon. If somebody had told me this several years ago that, see it in a different light, it's difficult to see it. You have to experience it yourself. You have to be with your garden, grow with your garden, see the changes, observe them yourself to feel those things. But it is definitely more enjoyable, all that change in the garden and in myself. Other things that are blooming now, Damianita daisies, not that much, but even the few flowers that are there are helpful for these pollinators. Wild tobacco, a volunteer that just showed up in the garden, it blooms well throughout the summer. Also, the elderberry tree that I mentioned earlier is providing a lot of shade, but it also continues to bloom and provide berries. they are a constant source of food for the mockingbirds that are always here in the garden, as well as the thrashers and the verdins and so many other birds. So and as well as other pollinators, including the butterflies and tarantula wasps. We have a lot of those. They visit also mesquite tree, the various other blooms, the flowers that are there in the garden, and they go after other little tiny insects as well. So yes, lots of other plants and other wildlife to talk about, but I will do that in the next episode. Thank you for listening. Bye bye.